So I have stories. It's not all the stories in the book. I could talk for hours on this. As she said, research is my passion. I was one of those kids that you give me an encyclopedia, and as long as I didn't have the section with the snakes, I was fine. And the snakes always got it shut. Take me to the library. Show me the card. I knew where the card catalog was. I can still smell those old books. And I could spend hours in the library. So Google's now my passion. So we'll have the next slide. And I want you to meet some of the family that I'll be talking about. My family came in 1849, settled on the Middle Fork of the American River. And these, let's see, this first gentleman here, he was about 13, or 11 to 13 on the wagon train. I can't remember if he was 11 or 13. His name's David Ferguson. Must have had a great time. We don't have any family stories. There was no diaries because his mom didn't know how to write. And so she didn't keep diaries. And he was busy with the cattle and the oxen and chores, you know, finding cow dung for fires. And then there was a giant fire, or a couple fires that wiped out any family memorabilia. And we'll talk about those. So it's all in talking to people and newspapers and various sources that I found out the history. But he walked about 20 miles a day as a young teen. From Missouri to El Dorado County. And at that time, 1849, they went through Reno, Dog Valley, and then came through Auburn to the Middle Fork. And they, on the census that summer, it says that they had a boarding house for the miners. The next lady is Mary Ferguson. She was my great-great-grandmother. She was about 7 when she walked west. And they didn't want to go in the wagon trains because, and we'll look at one of these wagons, they were just farm wagons. They had no shock absorbers on the rough trails, and so it was really better to walk. The next lady is her daughter, my great-grandmother, Hattie. And then it's my great-grandfather, Hugh Nichols. He was a tin miner in Cornwall, England. Came over in 1871 to see what he could do about finding gold. Most of the gold rush, we know, had tapered off. But he did a lot of hard rock mining all over, let's see, Uniontown, which is near Coloma, Greenwood, Georgetown. So that's him. Next slide. And then that lady, my great-great-grandmother, Mary Ferguson, she married a gentleman, and we'll talk about him because he factors into the Transcontinental Railroad not coming through El Dorado County and the effect of that. And he died. She married this gentleman. He was in 1872. It's Alexander Lee. He was a pretty famous figure from 1872 until he died in 1890. Came by land by himself. We think he probably just had a horse, got in with a wagon train, did some of their hunting, some of their help, maybe helped drive some wagons, and a very entrepreneurial person. So that is Alexander Lee. He eventually became the postmaster for Greenwood up by Georgetown. And then that's Mary. She was 30 when she married him. Like many marriages, pretty large age gap. She was devastated when he died, fell apart. They had 4 children together, and she had 2 children from her first marriage that felt Alexander was dad. Next. And then this. I found this picture on Ancestry.com. I think it's my great-great-grandfather's brother, but I'm not sure. The name was right. It is the Marsons. This is Lorenzo Marson. If the ages of the kids are about right too. That is Lorenzo Marson. He came with his brother from Maine. His brother was my great-great-grandfather. As far as we can tell, they came down the eastern seaboard to about Panama, then came across the isthmus, and by then there was a train. So I don't know if they hacked their way with machete or if they rode the train. But they went across to the west side. Then they had to wait in Panama for a ship that had room to take them up to San Francisco. So he was about 21 when he came. And the reason he and his brother came was they came in 1860. They left home in 1861. The Civil War was starting up. Almost all their brothers joined Union regiments. They didn't want anything to do with it. I was at Mount Rushmore last summer, and I'm watching the evening ceremony, and they're talking about the role of Abraham Lincoln. And I had this revelation that that is truly why they came, that they wanted to avoid the Civil War. There are no ship records for when they came, because a lot of the ships, they got to San Francisco, everybody got off, abandoned the ships. The Embarcadero is built on ship remains and a landfill. And so we have no records of how they got here, but they were from farmers in Maine who the grandparents had been seamen, so I'm pretty sure. That's his wife, Ellen. They're close in age. There's about 4 years difference between them. She came west. She was Ellen Ferguson. She was about 5 when she got to walk 20 miles a day. And he eventually became a blacksmith, and we'll talk about him a little bit later. Their eldest, they had 9 children. 3 of them died in a short time. And only way I know about all those is census records and some newspaper articles that said Mr. and Mrs. Marson had a boy, and then a couple of years later I read about a funeral. And that's their eldest daughter. She was born during the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Her nickname is Nettie, and she married a guy from Pilot Hill. That's her younger, well, the next one is Albert, and Albert is, so the next one's Albert, and then we have Alfonso, and he loved to dance and loved to go to parties, and he is buried in the Kelsey Cemetery with both of his parents and this little guy. I can't tell if the little guy is the youngest or if he's Clarence, and we'll talk about Clarence's mining death when he was 18. But then there was another little boy in there. So 6 kids and 3 that didn't survive childhood. Next one. So why even publish stories? My grandmother, you can see on the right, she was part of this family. She died of breast cancer in 1933. She left a 1.5-year-old and a 5-year-old. The 5-year-old was my dad. He was very upset. He didn't know why his mother wasn't coming home. She doted on her kids. And he was very upset. My grandfather, a couple years later, married a lady who had one child. So the agreement was they'd help each other and raise the kids. Well, my dad didn't want anything to do with that agreement. He wanted his mom. And so at some point when he was about 8 to 10, his, the mining relatives, we'll see their picture later, they were living in Sacramento by then. They said, why don't you send Robert to live with his gold rush uncles? And they can give him the guys information. They taught him all about mining. When I was a kid, and I'm the oldest, my dad made sure I knew how to pan for gold. I knew what skunk cabbage was up here, that I knew the difference between a sluice box and a long tom, and he loved that stuff. And my grandfather saw some of those stories, but my grandfather was part of a pioneer Oregon family. So he taught me a little bit of early genealogy, a little bit about family trees. He died in 1981, and we've progressed so far, so much since then, but I got the basics. And then when he died, he gave me her photo album that has pictures of 1910, it's up through about 1925. This picture came from her photo album. That picture that I had of David Ferguson and Mary Ferguson and my great-grandmother Hetty, those came from that photo album. I have a postcard of the dedication of the Marshall Monument in Coloma. There's some letters, all kinds of things. My grandfather knew that this kid that always had their nose buried in an encyclopedia or some sort of book, I was going to research. And in his older years, my dad did not want to talk about these stories. I once asked him, gave him a book to write everything down. He says, I don't want to go there. Those were very upsetting times to me. I just don't want to relive them. My mother told me little stories that she'd met these people in the early 1950s, and so she told me stories like your dad's relatives were involved with the railroad, and I'm thinking, what railroad? Was it the big transcontinental railroad? Was it Southern Pacific, Union Pacific? What was it? And she also said, your aunt lived in an old Victorian in downtown Sacramento. And I'm going, well, where was it? It's now torn down. I found it. But in looking at these things, and I talked to my oldest brother and my younger brother and sister, and they said, we never heard any of those stories. And I thought, I'd better write it down. And then I had a friend in 2020 pass away. She was afraid to go to the hospital because of COVID. She had a ruptured intestine, spent 2 months in ICU and died. And I said, okay, I'd better put them down. I don't think the family knows these stories. They definitely don't know all the stories. And even a second cousin that I've gotten in touch with through Ancestry.com, she said even she didn't know all the stories. Next slide. So that's why you need to put these stories down. People didn't just come for the gold, though, and I talk about this in my book. There was a worldwide panic of 1837, massive depression. The farmers in the Midwest couldn't sell their wheat, and they were isolated. So how are they going to teach their kids to read and write? And my great-great-great-grandfather, Thomas Ferguson, he had fought in the Indian Wars. He was born in 1897 in Philadelphia. No, 1797 in Philadelphia. And he wanted adventure. So this was the last gasp for adventure. He was like 41 or 51 when they came west. What they did is they converted old farm wagons. They had guidelines of how much of different products they could put in. And there really wasn't the room for the pianos and a lot of furniture. It was best if they just took a few trunks and the bare necessities. Single men usually just rode on horseback. Sometimes in movies, they have these big Conestoga wagons. The reality was those were not what came here to El Dorado County because they were too heavy to make it up over the Rockies and the Sierra. So what did the best was the converted farm wagons. One of the things I asked, and a friend of mine who now lives in Truckee, she lived for years and years in El Dorado County, and her son's an archaeologist. And I said, what happened to all those oxen that came, that survived the trip? And there was a gentleman in Ringgold, which is when you go on Pleasant Valley Road out of Diamond Springs and right around Big Cut, there's a mobile home park up on the hill. That was Ringgold. And there was a guy that would buy these oxen and rehabilitate them and then sell them to use, with sawmills and farmers later. But some entrepreneurial guy near Diamond Springs did that. This was a new life for the family. They weren't just stuck on the farm in their old ways. And there was a chance to find gold. My relatives settled in the property just north of the Bailey House. If you've gone up Highway 49, you pass the Bailey House on your way to Cool. There's a brand new driveway that goes up. That was the family property. In fact, a friend of mine is a realtor. And he said, when that property sold, a realtor in his office came and said, you wouldn't believe it. That title search went back into the 1800s with a family named the Fergusons. And he goes, read the book. And they had, just think, they go from their wheat fields that they had plowed and they were tilling. They go on this trip that took about 3 to 5 months. And they always had to leave. They usually left late March to avoid the Donner Party issues, getting through the Sierra too late. But they had to clear all this. My family's, this is actually part of the property just north of the Bailey house that the family had. We even found a tree that was this big that had been leveled in a fire or cut off or something. The new businesses, roadhouses and hotels, that's mainly what my family had. Bailey House, that's what that purpose was. Teamster, remember Alexander Lee's wedding photo? He became a Teamster. Ever wonder how they got that name Teamster? Yeah. I bet you know. Yeah, and if they can't hear, I will repeat it. Right, and so they were driving a team of horses or mules to deliver goods. And that's why they called them a Teamster. And that name has just stayed for truckers today. And farming in the new location, they had to clear all this. They ended up, my family had barley. Somebody I met on Facebook had all kinds of area history. So I've looked at the agricultural report. There were massive amounts of acres, but only a small amount was actually cleared. They had nut trees, maybe a few fruit trees. They had a lot of barley. And I was thinking, well, what'd they do with the barley? And my husband said, well, they fed the animals, the barley. They also made alcohol. And you figure from what I have read and put together, this was this old Irishman. He loved to sit around and tell stories, and he was not very nice. And so probably especially when he didn't have his alcohol. So later immigrants were like my great-great-grandfather and his brother Lorenzo to escape the Civil War, which was then called the War of the Rebellion, or Cornish miners such as my great-great-grandfather, or my great-grandfather. Next one. And so we had this big, huge boom in the 1850s, but by 1865, they had decided early 1860s, they decided where to build that route for the Transcontinental Railroad. Bailey thought it for sure was coming past his house. And, but they decided that instead of building it going right up the Sierra through El Dorado County, it was a more gradual rise to take it up where Interstate 80 now is. And so that's why that route was settled on. Because it didn't go through El Dorado County, a lot of the workers were leaving. And we had a massive drop in population. My great-great-grandfather, I found a newspaper ad, I think on newspapers.com or Genealogy Bank, and it said a business was closing. If you are in Alpine, contact these two gentlemen. If you are in El Dorado, contact Frank Marson. And I went, what kind of business is this? Turns out it was a sawmill business. And somebody on the Georgetown Divide Facebook group knew that and filled me in. And then I started doing all kinds of research on sawmills. So there were sawmills. This town down here, have you gone up 80 toward Reno and you get past Truckee and you see a turnoff for Boca and it's like there's nothing there? It was a thriving town. This is a photo that a relative had taken. My second cousin had it in her file. And it's the town of Boca. They had a brewery, an ice factory. They had all kinds of houses, schools. My great-great-grandmother was living there when her first husband died. And if you go, there's a nice little quarter-mile walk, goes past the schoolhouse. They have nice signs explaining what was in these different sections, and you end up at the cemetery. And there's only about 5 remaining tombstones. And that's because a few people had marble or granite tombstones made for their relatives. My great-great-grandfather originally had a wood tombstone that burned in one of the many fires. And so some of his relatives decided he needed this tombstone. It was made in Sacramento and hauled up to Boca. And he's one of the existing, 5 existing tombstones in that cemetery. He died of smallpox. There was a smallpox epidemic. And there were sawmills because they had to support all that business, plus do ties for the railroad that was going up over the Sierra. All those trestles, the big giant trestles, that needed the wood. Lumber yards. My great-great-grandfather, the one whose tombstone's there, he ran lumber yards in various places. I went to Placer County Archives, and I was looking for Alexander Lee or James Franklin Marson. And the archivist said, let me see what I can find on the computer. And she says, could Frank Marson be your relative? Turns out he got involved in some scams. And I call my book Skeletons in the Closet because a lot of these stories are stories my mother would have rather had just in the closet about my dad's family. And what had happened is he was working at a sawmill. The owners didn't pay him. And so they said, hey, we'll show you how we do this, and you can defraud some other owners. And so he did a sawmill like that. There were some lawsuits. I didn't search further to see what the outcome of those lawsuits was, but I know there were scams going on because everybody was desperate to do work for the railroad. A lot of laborers. I think that's how Lorenzo Marson became a blacksmith. What it says in the voting records and the census records is laborer is his occupation. When he came back to El Dorado County, he was here in the early 1860s, married Ellen. They took off for Placer County and Nevada County. And, but when he came back to El Dorado County, he became a blacksmith. Hard labor, and who knows what was his labor occupation. They had those rails to lay. They had all kinds of projects. And I gave you Frank's sawmill story, so next one. The Lees, Alexander Lee, and my great-great-grandmother Mary. This was the Lee's American Exchange Hotel. They started to have kids. So they married in 1872. Kids were starting by 1875, plus she had 2 kids from her previous marriage. And they decided that there was property for sale. Somebody had a hotel in Greenwood that they wanted to sell, so they bought it, renovated it. They also thought that there was going to be another mining boom. And a lot of books, that's where I got that information. There was going to be another mining boom, so they were doing a lot of businesses, stores, hotels in Greenwood. And as I did this, I have found some of these characters. Alexander and Mary are right in the front. Mary's with that chair. My great-grandfather Hugh, he's the one with the shot stance in the back, or right behind Mary. And he was a boarder at the, around 1875, 76, up until 1883. He spent a fair amount of time living at that hotel. And then another relative, Thomas Marson, he's the eldest son of the guy that died in Boca. He's probably about 17, standing there in the back. So, and so I've pointed out those. In 1890, though, there was a flu epidemic. They called it the Russian flu. Well, with coronavirus going around 2020, around late 2020, some researchers decided we're going to see what the symptoms were of these people that died of different flu epidemics. They said the Spanish flu was truly a flu epidemic, but 1890 was a coronavirus event. The people had the same difficulty breathing. From onset to death, it was about 2 weeks. And that's what Alexander died of. It was about 2 weeks that he was sick, and then he died. There was no way to treat him, and Mary was just devastated. All of a sudden, she had to run this hotel. She had 6 kids. Yeah, a couple of them were starting out on their own, and this was the love of her life. So now within maybe 20 years, she had had 2 husbands die. And so what happened is it was a chimney fire. Right behind Alexander, you'll see the chimney. And they built on a separate room as a kitchen. And one night they had a fire, and they had to ring the bell so that it wouldn't spread to the other nearby businesses and wipe out all of Greenwood. So it confined to the hotel. Some people want to know who's up top. We don't know. But that's very common in a lot of the hotels. Next one. Okay, since we've got the fire going on right now, and I was surprised at how much more smoke we had today as opposed to yesterday. This was the Great Fire of 1891. It was a windy October day, very dry. Have we seen that before? It started just west of Penobscot Ranch. Penobscot Ranch is just on the left side of that where it says Greenwood. It went directly west, driven by wind. It wiped out Hogg's Diggings, wiped out the Ferguson Hotel, and the Bailey's farm crew and all of their people there hosed it down, and they managed to keep it away from burning the Bailey house. But it finally ended up at the river. David Ferguson, that tall guy on the first slide, he managed to move his 7 horses, we think probably south to Centerville, Pilot Hill, where Lorenzo and Lorenzo's wife, Ann Ferguson, were doing blacksmithing. And somehow they got the 80-year-old mother out. We don't know, because David didn't read and write. So I have no idea. And the family house was destroyed. Let me read you something that was just, I recently found in a newspaper. Sacramento, September 29th of 1891. For several days past, there's been a raging on Georgetown Divide in Dorado County, the most terrible forest fire ever experienced in California. The fire caught by the town of Greenwood and fanned by a strong north wind, have we heard about north winds? Has swept over almost the entire stretch of country between Georgetown and Salmon Falls. The little mining town of Pilot Hill was literally wiped from the face of the earth. The fire, it avoided the Bailey Hotel, and much of Pilot Hill was saved, but a lot north, everything north was gone. Fire passed over a section of country 25 miles in length and 25 miles wide. It's not known that there had been any loss of life, but there were many narrow escapes. Like I told you about David getting his 7 horses out, and Mom. For the days and nights, hundreds of men have been battling with the flames. Some of them were blackened and blistered and have thrilling experiences to relate. A gentleman who was in the vicinity says that he, one night, heard the roar of the flames when they were fully 3 miles distant. State Printer Johnson, who came down to Sacramento from Cool yesterday and who traveled over a portion of the burned district, says he's never before viewed such a scene of destruction and utter devastation. Magnificent forests of a few days ago burned over and blackened, and lofty pines seared and killed. The scene at night, it is said, baffled all powers of description, there being a moving mass of fire as far as the eye can reach. And then it says, last night the flames were somewhat subdued, but it's feared that the increased velocity of the wind today will start the fire upon a new lease of destruction. Sounds a lot like today. So they were battling that then. Okay, next one. Next slide.
It's interesting to see the topography.
And then, but it wasn't just wildfires. There were house fires. There were building fires. You know that they cooked with wood. They heated with wood. In the agricultural report, it said my family had cut 80 cords of wood. And I got to thinking, did they sell it? They could have sold some, but they ran a drafty, big boarding house and used it for their heating and their fire. And so, 1893, June. My great-grandmother, Hetty, she asked her oldest daughter, who was about 9 years old, would you ask your 9-year-olds to do this? To have the fire in the cook stove ready to fix a new meal when she came back from visiting relatives or friends in town. And they lived north of Highway 193 in around Slager Mine Road, Spanish Springs. And so sometimes she'd go visit her mom at the hotel in Greenwood. And she got back, well, the 9-year-old didn't have the fire ready. And so she said, well, gather a lot of the dried cow pies, we'll use those for kindling. So they went out, and she said, this still isn't burning fast enough. She put kerosene on it. The whole thing went whoosh, and went up to the roof and burned the house down. Well, so much for lunch. They had no insurance. This is the house they rebuilt. And it was close to probably similar to what they had, except they ended up having 5 kids. And, but it's very rough wood. You can see the front. There are some steps to get up into a wood porch. It's all hand-built, and they had no insurance. And a lot of businesses and homeowners did not have insurance then. Next. Stagecoaches. And this is another one of my family stories. One of the family members was involved in a stagecoach robbery. There's the big stagecoach. You think of stagecoaches as the Wells Fargo Museum pieces, and there's one in the History Museum at the fairgrounds. That was fine to go to the big towns, but to go between Auburn, Forest Hill, Greenwood, Georgetown, this is what they used. And you'll see on the top there was a protection, but then they had canvas roll-down windows in case the winds and the rain got too bad. And this would make regular runs from Auburn to, well, it could go, I believe this one went Auburn, through the canyon to, it either went first to Forest Hill or it went through the canyon, up to, through Cool to Georgetown. It was going to Greenwood and Georgetown. Well, it got just before Greenwood. Remember Penobscot Ranch, where that fire started? Got to Penobscot Ranch. And there was this guy with big rap sheet. He was known to local sheriffs. And they had a feeling he might have done that. And they tracked him down, and they found all kinds of weapons. But they were also hearing from the people that had been on the wagon that there were a couple accomplices. And so they gave a reward, and they finally tracked those down to a J.C. Collins and 18-year-old Perrin Lee, my Marion Alexander's son, youngest son. And Alexander had died in 1890, and Mom was really having difficulty. Basically, those boys, a lot of times, were raising themselves. Mom just didn't know what to do. She'd always left it to her husbands to raise the boys. And now he wasn't there. And occasionally Lorenzo would come in and help. But he had his own life and his own kids, so he did what he could. Perrin thought, oh, robbing a stagecoach? Then I'll have money, and I'll have tales to tell. And he was a red-headed, fun-loving guy. And so all were arrested, charged with stagecoach robbery. Normally, that would be a hanging offense, but they were charged with robbery, and since nobody was killed, they were, the ringleader and J.C. Collins were sent to San Quentin for 8 years. I found no reports of what happened to Perrin Lee. I knew he was around, but what happened to Perrin? And a lot of the stories I got from this are from this On and Beyond the Georgetown Divide history set. And you can see I go through and look at the names and then put little markers. And a lot of the stories of the stagecoach robbery are here. But I couldn't find anything about Perrin Lee. I looked in the microfiche at the Placerville Library. I've looked on Genealogy Bank and newspapers.com, which the Mountain Democrat is with newspapers.com. And couldn't find anything. I'm sitting there at my writing table, and I'm thinking, what happened? And Lorenzo, Mary's family, after Alexander died, or I guess before, when they were working on the railroad, it seemed like I didn't hear the two families conversing. This little voice says, "Look further." And I went, okay. And what I figured out in looking at the family is Lorenzo was involved. He brought paint to Mary, and he and his sons helped paint the hotel when it needed paint. And he tried to be a mentor to the boys, and he made them a deal that if you were involved in a crime, as long as nobody was killed, he would do what he could to get the charges dropped. But you only got one get-out-of-jail-free card. And after that, you were on your own. And so that was Perrin's first offense. That's why it went away. We'll see in the next slide how it came to bite Perrin. And so that was the great stagecoach robbery. These guys had 8 years, both had 8 years at hard labor at San Quentin. Okay, next one. And so then in 1899, you figured the hotel's there in Greenwood. You've got Mary running the hotel, and this lady, Georgia Gardner, I met her before she passed. She knew my deceased grandmother quite well, and she told me all kinds of stories about the hotel. Mary ran it, was a wonderful hostess. They had boarders there who would have the noon meal. People could come from town and pay for the noon meal. And this one guy, Big Jim Reynolds, he had been drinking. He wasn't mining that day because the weather was rainy and muddy. And the Georgetown Gazette called him almost insane when drinking. And so he came into the hotel for the noon meal. He starts making, it just said, unacceptable remarks. And so we don't know what those unacceptable remarks were to the 16-year-old youngest daughter of Mary and Alexander. And so she went, "Mom, he said this." And Mom came out and she says, "That is unacceptable." So then he went on a tirade about her and how clueless and unacceptable she was. Well, Perrin said, "That's enough." And these boys had been taught, you respect women. You respect your mother. And so he came at the guy with the chair, swung a chair, hit him in the head, and the guy just stumbles out. He went across the street toward Winkleman's Brewery, and Perrin's chasing him. Perrin's the top guy on the sepia photo, and in some mining clothes. And his brother Alex 1 or 2 years older than he was. He's coming home from lunch, for lunch, from work at the Slager mine. And parent says, "This is what happened." And Alex goes and gets his brother to help him beat up Big Jim. Well, finally, people pulled them off. Big Jim, the doctor worked on him, but he died the next day. So now Perrin and Alex are charged with murder. And at the murder trial, they wanted to try them both together. Alex says, "I haven't had a first offense. Perrin's had a first offense, so I want a separate trial." And so they had separate trials. It was big in the newspaper. That was a headline for like a week or two. And they were both found not guilty, and a big reason was excessive drink. And you have to think this was sort of the start of the time of the temperance unions. And so that was a big murder trial. My second cousin and I both knew about it, and I think I knew about it because my grandfather told me. Next slide. And so mining is dangerous work, dirty work. Alex and Perrin were both longtime miners. Perrin, toward the end of his life, worked for, wasn't Greenwood, it was Greenwood Hines. They ran a lot of Slager mine. My Cornish great-grandfather, he was mining superintendent at Slager mine. And Alex discovered a north seam in Slager mine, so they were all involved with Slager mine. And that's a kind of dry drift mining that they'll look at the quartz and see the quartz, and they'll look at the veins, and let's dig and follow this. And there were requirements that they had to publish in the newspaper at least once a year that they'd been working the claim, otherwise other people could come and work it. But it could be, I mentioned it's dangerous. And so my great-great-grandfather Hugh, he had all kinds of mining accidents. He's the one whose house burned down when his wife put the kerosene on the fire. And I have later letters that I had my husband read it and help me with some of the contrast on the photo. And he says, "It sounds like a very lonely man. His wife had died, his kids had moved away, and he's trying to figure out who can come can all the goods in my garden." But he did a lot of mining, and there's a story in one of the Georgetown Gazette books that I showed that he was working with a partner, and they were going down a vertical air shaft. The rope broke. Hugh was on the outside. The guy that was on the rope fell down in, and there was rocks on the bottom, and the guy died. My husband grew up in Auburn, and he used to go down a mine shaft, some air. He has a story about going down an air shaft. Nylon water ski rope and ski gloves, and slipped. He says he banged against the side. There were ladders, there were dead rattlesnakes, and he got to the bottom, and he told his buddies at the top, "Don't come, I'll find a side shaft." But his partner actually died. This partner died. And then another time, there's another story in the Gazette books about Hugh had been inside with an ore cart. End of the day, the brake on the ore cart broke, and he went down the shaft. And they said he was fine, just very shaken up. And they had to be tough to mine. And mining's I equate in the book, it's like gambling. You don't know if you're going to strike it rich. And so in the early 1900s, there was some of the mining companies would come in, and they would hire the miners for wages. And the miners loved this because they were no longer gambling about what they would find. They at least could have some pay. Up around Kelsey, a lot of slate. When you go down Chili Bar Canyon, you can see the dark slate. Well, just outside Kelsey, it was a town called Slatington, and I got these pictures from the County Historical Museum, actually paid them for the use of the pictures. The bottom one was the miner's cabin. Lorenzo Marson, his wife, and Lorenzo Marson, his wife Ellen, and his 3 youngest boys all lived there. The 2 older boys, Alfonso, who liked to dance, and Clarence, worked at the mine. Lorenzo was sort of a mobile blacksmith, and he would work wherever was needed. So they lived in the cabin, and one day, that top picture is what it would look like to the miners. And so they were trying to get the slate rocks down. They would use the slate for roofs, walkways. It was a rainy March or April day. And no, it was, June 1904. Rains had come, soaked the area, and a piece of slab, 1-ton piece of slab, came sliding down, went right on his leg, severed the artery, and they couldn't lift it. Finally, by the time they got it off, and his brother, Alfonso, was there. And Alfonso helped the guys, carried it to the cottage, and he died. They had a funeral service in the mining superintendent's house, which was an all-slate house on the property. 3 doctors came from Placerville. They had to traverse the canyon at Chili Bar and get back up, but they were too late. And shortly after that, by mid-1906, the Marsons left here and said, we have health issues of our own. We're getting off the divide and moving to Placerville. And so in 1904, what I found out is the telephone came to El Dorado County in 1902. And so they had some telephones. And so they were able to contact the older daughters and the oldest son and say, sobbing, Clarence is dead, and arranged the funeral. But we've had telephones for 120 years here in El Dorado County. Next slide, thank you. And so blacksmithing, I've talked about Lorenzo Marson. He worked on the railroad, and later he came back with his family to Pilot Hill. He went into business with George Kirchner. Where the property is just south of the town of Pilot Hill. And, and then he would travel all over. At one point, he was working at Big Bar with his son-in-law, George Kirchner, and George Jr. And just wherever somebody needed him, they'd call him or send a message and say, we need help rebuilding wagon wheels or whatever, and he would go help. But in 1906, 2 years after his son had died there at Slatington, he moved to Upper Placerville, and within just a few months, he was dead. I think he knew he was sick. His wife had some kidney-related disease, and she was often confined to bed. And they just knew. The doctor couldn't be up close. And so where they were is, do you know where Hazard Street is in Placerville, Upper Placerville, where the police station is? you go by the police station, you go uphill behind the police station. That's Hazard. That's where they settled. And I had an address. I found recently the next door neighbor's house had sold. And so I looked at the realtor pictures and she says, yeah, that's pretty much, the realtor told me that was pretty much how it was in 1906 when that house was new. So that's where they moved. And then I also found records that Albert, their eldest son, here Lorenzo had died. So he contacted George Kirchner and said, do you want, Lorenzo's gone. How about if you do a blacksmith shop here in Placerville? And so he financed the eldest son of Lorenzo, financed a blacksmith shop on Union Street. I can't find out where on Union Street because I'd have to go to the recorder's office, and I just haven't done that. But Union Street goes down and becomes Highway 50, basically, and I have a feeling somewhere right around there that became Highway 50 is where it was. So that was 1909, but on the census records, by 1920, didn't see the shop, and George Kirchner was now a blacksmith and car mechanic for a company in Sacramento, and they lived in the Lamb Park area. Little 2-bedroom cottage that's still there. Next slide. But blacksmithing, that's what happened to the blacksmiths. They often became mechanics. This is the family that I've been identifying. Let's see. The gentleman toward the left with the glasses, that's Alex Lee. He's the one that was on the murder trial, in 1899. And his brother Perrin is right next to him. They often spent time in Sacramento at the old Victorian my mother had told me about. And they never married. My grandmother, who died when my dad was 5, her sister is on her older sister. Her older sister's on the left, and her oldest sister is right there in the middle holding the baby. The guy in the back is about 20 years older than she is, and that's her husband. He was an early miner in Volcano in Amador County. The next older guy, that's the eldest son of Mary and Alexander. There are stories where he became a miner. He worked on the American River. He also worked Ophir. And there was a big mining boom down in near Yosemite. And he went there to Mount Bullion. And sometime there, his wife died. She's buried in the Merced Cemetery. But I can't find out why she died, why she's in Merced. I think it could have been childbirth. It could have been a disease. We don't know. But she's buried in Merced, and he fell apart. There are some stories in the Greenwood books about him. But he finally, after the last incident, this gentleman, his brother-in-law, the gentleman up front, told the El Dorado County Sheriff, I don't want him back. He has an alcohol issue. It's not being treated. Take him to the state hospital in Stockton and commit him. So the sheriff did. Sheriff, not too long after that, committed suicide. But committed Will. Will was there for 6-8 months and finally said, this is unlawful incarceration. And he had been working with a psychologist. They let him out. He checked himself out. He never, ever had a drinking incident again. And he ended up, in 1922, he was in Newcastle. There was a series of big fires in Newcastle in 1922. The third fire was in October of that year. He was working at a pool hall and soda fountain, living upstairs, and he went up to grab his stuff and didn't make it down. And so, and then down here is that youngest daughter, May, the one who Big Jim had made disparaging remarks to. She was the one that owned that old Victorian. And that's her husband. If you've ever been to the Greenwood Cemetery, there's this obelisk in there. That's his relatives. And there are 3 young kids that died in December one year. And we don't know if it's dysentery, cholera. It was in the late 1800s. His twin brother was one of those 3. And so he became a very much a protector of the family. After Alexander had died, he came in about 15 years later, took over taking care of the family. When the house burned down in Greenwood, when that hotel burned down in 1914, what did they do? They went to Marysville, where most of the family was mining with the dredges, and Mary lived with these 2. So how do you date a photo? This was in my second cousin's collection from her mom on the left, or her grandma on the left. How do you date these things? So I have figured that this was after 1920, because Mary died in January 1920. And it was before 1922 when Will died. So sometime there in the early 1920s, that's as close as I can come. And I think that's close enough. The guy on the very far right is the 2 people at the bottom, May and Albert. That's their younger son. He became a Sacramento cop. Next slide. And so I always call this the end. It's why people died. So we had in the 1850s a lot of cholera and dysentery. When the Fergusons came and walked all that distance, their eldest daughter, Rebecca, and her husband came. And after reading all kinds of divorce stuff and different things from family members, we think that Thomas Ferguson made his daughter and son-in-law bring their own wagon, because otherwise they would have had 8 people or something in one wagon. So he says, you bring your own wagon. And they arrived in 1849. By February of 1850, Rebecca had died. We think cholera. And because there was a big cholera epidemic, they, in the book I explain what happened to, we never could find out what happened to the husband. It looks like he went to Paradise, farmed, and died of meningitis. And when they went through his things, they had always, his friends there knew him as a longtime bachelor. But when they went through his things, they said it looks like he had been married at one time. So that's what happened to the oldest daughter's husband. Now, they had another daughter, but Dad decided she would have been 17 when they're traveling. He didn't want her involved with these gentlemen, and maybe she was a little sickly. We don't know what her health situation was, but he left her to nanny at some relative's house. Rebecca dies. Mom needs somebody to help with the cooking and the cleaning and building the house and getting things ready, and what do you do with the 2 little girls? And so had Elizabeth come out. We figure Elizabeth arrived sometime around August to early September, when most of the wagons did. By the end of September, she was dead. We don't know why. But so lot of death on the trail, and a lot of it was cholera and dysentery. Skin cancer. We talked about David Ferguson, that tall gentleman at the very start. Letters about his death. He had a growth coming out his ear, and the doctor tried to remove it, but didn't get it all. And I talked to my dermatologist, and the dermatologist said that was temporal skin cancer. And it had spread, and they had no treatment for skin cancer. Our sunscreen didn't come out until the 1950s. So as sunscreen and not just zinc oxide. And so skin cancer for these old farmers and the people that walked here, that was a problem. Tuberculosis was an issue, also called consumption, coughing up blood and so forth. They called it consumption because the people lost so much weight. Chewing gum was developed because people were just chewing their tobacco and spitting on the sidewalk and trying to make the spittoons, but they didn't always make it. And so Wrigley invented his chewing gum so they could switch from having the chewing tobacco and just have the gum and swallow the spit. People were afraid of catching it. There's a letter that I've come into possession of that heavy person on the left-hand side of the last photo. She was visiting in Placerville. I think at the time she was living in the East Bay. And her mom says, I heard so-and-so has tuberculosis. You better watch it. I hope you don't spend time with him. Closest sanitarium was in Weimar. And Alfonso and most of the Marsons died of tuberculosis. Smallpox, I mentioned smallpox. They did have vaccines for smallpox, but some articles I read said a lot of people thought smallpox would only attack those that are poor and homeless. And so that's why we still had epidemics. And then I mentioned the influenza versus the coronavirus event. Next slide. So if you haven't already gotten a sheet of paper with a list of sources, you can always get one at the check-in table in the back. I've mentioned several of these. Of course, do Ancestry.com and Family Search. If you see people with a family tree, contact them and say, do you have any pictures? Alexander it turned out, had a brother, I have found two brothers came to visit in the 1870s after the Civil War. One died in Michigan Bluff, and the other one had gone back to Pennsylvania. And so I sent somebody a note and said, do you have any family pictures? She says, I've got a box, but I haven't identified people. But you never know. Local museums and county archives, these are a couple that I found really helpful. The county clerk's office and the recorder's office. It was interesting getting birth certificate or death certificates for for Perrin and Alex, and I knew Will had died in the fire. So Perrin and Alex and May, they died in Sacramento. And it was interesting that one of their nieces almost died of the same thing. And it was some abdominal aneurysms. And then property records, I found out what happened to the hotel after Alexander died. The property actually went to his wife, which I found was very interesting in 1890. The local LDS library, state archives in Sacramento, and the museums. In writing this book in 2020, I was trying to figure out how much did it cost when Mary's first husband died in Boca. How did she get back to El Dorado County? How did she get back to Pilot Hill? Did she take the train? Did she take a wagon? And so I called the Railroad Museum. And they said, here was the timetable between Boca and Auburn. Here was how much it cost. And it turns out it costs a lot more to ride the train up the Sierra because they use more coal and wood. To ride it down, there was a lot of just coasting, and so the ticket wasn't expensive. What I figured out is Lorenzo brought her by wagon, or else she drove the wagon herself to get back. Next one. And just a few others, websites and books for the area, payolis that you can get at the historical museum's great. I absolutely love these, On and Beyond the Georgetown Divide. There's quite a few books. I've got a whole shelf in my bookcase with these. Facebook groups. If you aren't on Facebook and want to look for stories or have questions, at least go on for that. El Dorado County history, Georgetown Divide history, Placer County history have had great stories. There's a story in the book about something that's been going on Facebook, Placer County lately a lot. And they've been having articles about the last man hanged in Auburn. He was hanged because he killed my great-grandfather's brother. And so there's all kinds of information in the book, and I've gotten details talking to some of the people on the Placer County website. Newspapers, lots of newspapers are there. Society of California Pioneers, I have some photos in my book. And my basic thing is read, and research some more. There was one of those archives. They're tan colored. I couldn't put my hand on it immediately before I left home. They have one about American River history. And there's a little section about Alexander Lee and a gentleman's picture. It's not him. I have no idea who it is, but that's why you need to keep researching. Listen to the little voices in your head. They have told me to search, and I have found awesome stories and even more information. Next one. And so I'm Nancy Porter. That's one way that you can get a hold of me. Here's the title of the book, and it's also on that cheat sheet. It's available at Placerville News. Well, they sold their last book yesterday when a friend of mine bought it. And Face in a Book, bookstore. Or contact me. I have business cards in the back with the